Hi, everyone. Thanks for signing in to watch this walkthrough for Chapter 9. Again, apologies that we couldn't meet in person today, but I should be able to get through the chapter relatively quickly so that you're not, having to watch a video for very long. Um, let's get into it. Let's see. In this particular chapter, we're talking about managing the internal audit function. And so we're going to talk a lot about the setup. We know a lot about the structure and stuff, but we're going to talk about, sort of the roles and responsibilities and other things with planning and sort of a lot of the topics that we've touched on already, but sort of how it all gets pulled together. So let's get started. Hiring objectives, that's great. Yeah, basically all the standards is what I guess through the 1000s and 2000s, like everything touches on managing it because everything's related to getting the thing done. All right. So first thing, let's talk about how the internal audit group is positioned, as they say, or where they are sort of set up within the company. Now we've talked about this as far as how the internal audit needs to be sort of separate, and they're reporting through their chief audit executive, who is reporting to straight to the audit committee, not through regular management. But the real key there is that they are set up with it in such a way that they can succeed. Um, it says here that maximize the effectiveness and ability to evaluate the efficacy of risk management, control, and governance processes. And so that you really want your team in a position where they're able to go in and make those assessments and make those judgment calls. And let's be honest, your first year, second year, third year uh, internal auditors aren't really the ones that are making these decisions. This is all being set up at sort of that director level, or whenever I say director, I mean like the chief audit executive director level. Um, but down here at the bottom talks about the different ways that an internal audit group should be set up in order to be effective. And if we look at them, so achieves the responsibility included in the internal audit charter, which we're going to talk about in a minute, conforms with the standards. Obviously, that makes sense that your IA group should conform with the standards. The individual members conform with the code of ethics and the standards. So the audit group as a whole, and the audit and your work product should conform with standards. But each individual person should be doing things the way that they're supposed to be doing. That includes, taking that ethics-based approach, as well as performing within the scope of, the standards as they currently are. And then this last one, considering trends and emerging issues that could impact the organization, that's another item that a lot of times is going to be, handled a little higher up the food chain. That's, you've got sometimes external auditors bring in information because there's changes in, accounting policies or procedures. And, even for big internal audit groups, a big internal audit group is truthfully still smaller than even like a regional external auditing firm. I mean, they just are, because they're only doing their one company and subs or whatever. But still, they're not going to be as big as a firm, and because they're focused on performing internal audit services basically year round, that's really all they're doing. They don't necessarily have positions within the company to go out and evaluate new and emerging topics, especially whenever it comes to like accounting topics, or if there's things procedurally from like a process management standpoint from the operational side or something. They're not necessarily they don't necessarily have the time or the, immediate resources to see those changes happening. And so oftentimes that information is brought to them. And again, through the external auditors, through other members within the company. And it's at that point that they then address, okay, how are we as the internal audit group going to, handle this? Is there something we need to do? Yes or no? If so, then let's add it into, our plan. So that first requirement on the prior page, the charter, this should be, for a company that has their own internal audit group, you really should have a specific, written out charter. It's one of those things that if it's not written down somewhere, then it's subject to being challenged. Excuse me. It's subject to being challenged. And, that's not good for anybody. And, you can, at any level in the corporate world, having things written down is always, better proof of just saying, well, we had this discussion. I was actually advising a friend recently who's wanting to set up a single member S corporation, and he was just asking some generalized questions. But there are things, even for a single member company like he's wanting to run, he has to have a board meeting, even if he's the only one that's in it. He has to have it, and he has to have this, make decisions and stuff like that. Now, does he need to talk out loud to himself? No, but he basically needs to sit down, go through, certain topics as far as the normal things you would see a board talking about. How did the year go? What's the plan going forward? What are other big decisions? What direction am I planning to take the company? All those things. And then you need to put it in minutes, sign it, and literally save a physical copy. Now, have an electronic copy, let's be honest, is probably okay. But as silly as it sounds, having something on paper is always stronger evidence. So in this case, we should have an internal audit charter, written out that specifically talks about, these green bubbles, which it says, those must be covered in a charter. So its purpose within the organization, like why does it exist? How much authority does it have? That's also position within the organization. That's weird. Anyway, and then responsibilities. So I guess those three things, maybe that one's doubly important, the position. And then these other things around the outside are stuff that it says down here, key areas that when addressed strengthen the internal audit function. But we've already said we should adhere to the standards. We're going to talk in a minute about being objective and independent, understanding the scope of activities, and that means like how extensive are the activities that we're performing, quality, and having something as simple as a mission statement. What is the mission of the function? Having those things can make your internal audit group better and can strengthen, that written charter, because you can then come back to it later and say, hey, we even have this documented that this is what we want to achieve. Especially if you're getting pushback from management and you've said, this is how it's documented. The audit committee has approved it. The management's approved it. This is how we're going to get to where we need to get to. That's just always going to be stronger support. Okay, so independence and objectivity. Like I said, they were I think they were in one of the yellow bubbles on the prior sheet. And I know that we've talked about this, but externally, you have to be truly independent. And that means, no financial investments, no, like even things like, say, having a romantic relationship with someone at a client site. I remember at KPMG, we actually had that happen where, one of the staff associates started seeing one of the staff members at a client that she was on, they had to disclose that, to our sort of our local partners. And then he, of course, had to tell the folks at his company. And, it honestly wasn't a big deal. We moved her off the job onto another job. Really not a big deal. But the important thing was that it was communicated, it wasn't hidden. So whenever we look at the independence and objectivity of an internal audit function, we recognize that there can be true independence because you're getting paid by the company, but you can be impartial and have an unbiased attitude, and then avoid conflicts of interest. So similar story, or not a similar story, but under the same concept, if you have someone in your internal audit department who starts seeing someone, say, in the controller's office or one of the businesses or whatever, then that person shouldn't be working on the internal audit where the other person's function lies. And really, even if the other person isn't in finance, it would be a bad look if, say, they're some kind of production engineer and you get sent over to the plant to work on stuff where that person is working. That could be perceived as an independence or a conflict of objectivity. So we want to try and avoid that. What does it go through specifically? All right, so be honest. Individual objectivity requires the chief audit executive to make staff assignments that prevent potential and actual conflicts of interest and bias. So again, that's kind of what I was getting into. You have to let people know. Or if you have something else, it could be a family member that works there. Lots of other things that could cause a potential conflict of interest. Down here, internal audit work must be reviewed. And that's like anything else. You can't have, a staff auditor doing a bunch of work, like, say, auditing an entire location's control processes, and then just sticking it in your overall documentation, and then it's done for the year. Like, someone has to go through it, look at it, make sure that the work's been done to that person's satisfaction or to the satisfaction of whatever's described in the audit charter. And then, if it's not, then they send it back and say, hey, can you go work on this piece? And that's, again, very similar to public accounting. Let's see. Objectivity is not negatively affected when the auditor recommends enhancements to standards or controls. So that's important. You can make recommendations. You can say, hey, I saw this. Maybe if you did that, it would help the problem. What you can't do is, actually designing and then making sure that the control is in place and operating effectively and doing all these things. Like, you're going to come back and test it, but other than giving sort of a broad, this is how this could be done, you really shouldn't be doing more than that. Because if you're doing more than that, then basically you're coming back and you're auditing your own work. And the other thing is that you don't want them to take you just whatever you say and copy it straight down, because things can be lost in translation. It could be whenever you come back to it later and look at it, maybe something's, reworded a little bit differently, but maybe it changes the scope of stuff. Just lots of things from that perspective. Yeah. Let's see. And again, with related to making suggestions. And then the occasional performance of non-audit work by the internal auditor. So it's not uncommon for firms to offer short rotations. Again, I did a 1-week job with internal audit where we went to our Cleveland, paint manufacturing facility, and I worked on the internal audit with one of our other auditors. That's okay. In that instance, I was doing a rotation into internal audit for a week, and they fully believed that I could be objective and impartial and not cause problems, and so they agreed to that. And they done, other people, it was a sort of a standard program that we had. So, it wasn't the first time that any of us had, that kind of experience. And then now at our company, it was a little less uh, common to have one of the internal auditors come do a rotation somewhere else. But truthfully, most of our internal auditors only spent 2 to 3 years in that position before moving out of internal audit, into another uh, part of the business. So, all right, let's keep going. Again, here with independence and objectivity, breaks what we're doing is we're breaking down a couple things and giving some examples here where we talk about, you know, again, it's organizational independence, individual objectivity, so personal conflicts of interest. A scope limitation is typically whenever like you can't do something, either because the location or whatever won't let you perform some kind of work. Since we're talking about the individual auditors, it may be that the person themselves can't or won't do the work. Um, it could be. I'm trying to think of an example. The best example I can think of is if someone has like a religious uh, something that what maybe a religious holiday or something, and it's very important to them, and they're not going to be working that day, but say the company's doing their inventory count and internal audit needs to be there. Well, that's a scope limitation, and that you say, if I'm the only person that can be assigned to it, I can't be there. And the company can't really come back out and be, well, you can't attend your religious event or whatever. You have to do what we say. Like, that's just not how the world works generally. You might have individual managers, places that act like that, but generally that's not how things work. um so in that case, you'd have a scope limitation unless they find someone else to do it. They're probably not going to change the date because that was probably already set. Restrictions on access to records, personnel, properties, and resource limitations such as funding. At the last company I worked for, we didn't have an internal audit function because we weren't public and we didn't need one. But we actually had a limitation on our external audit report because we would not allow any of our auditors to see our payroll information. And so they were not able to test it. They basically had to take our word for it. They could do some very high level analytics as far as total salary divided by, how many people we had working or whatever, but it couldn't be actually audited. And so we always had that limitation in our audit. But again, we were private, and we had reached an agreement with our lenders and people like that it was okay. Proficiency in dual professional care. So these are both defined in specific standards, and you know, basically, what we're talking about is the ability to do your work appropriately, and to make sure that you're being careful while you're doing it. That's sort of the best layman's terms that I can give for it. Um, it gives this definition here: internal auditors. Oh, let me highlight the whole thing. Internal auditors must possess the knowledge, skills, and other competencies needed to perform their individual responsibilities. The internal audit activity collectively must possess or obtain the knowledge, skills, and other competencies needed to perform its responsibilities. So again, basically, it's saying that if you're a total space cadet, you don't know anything, and you're not really sort of helping the function, then you're sort of outside of what the standards would expect you to be. Truth is, pretty much everyone that gets hired into those positions are going to be people that they expect to be able to meet that standard. Um, I guess there's instances where people may not, or there's always things where someone doesn't work out for this reason or that. But again, it's generally making sure someone can do the job, and then uh, do professional care is sort of a weird one. Apologies, I had to pause the recording there, so if the sound comes through a little bit weird, my dogs started barking, and I had to pause it and go quiet them down. Um, so sorry about that. Anyway, get back to it. Uh, the other part here, do professional care. So do professional care, reasonably prudent and competent internal auditor. Here's the important part: does not imply infallibility. Um, that mistakes happen. Uh, carelessness can sometimes happen. Um, you they need to try and do as good of a job as they can, but we don't expect perfection. We really can't expect perfection anywhere. Whenever I was reading this, though, it started me thinking about whenever we talk about professional care, do internal audit groups ever get sued? And, which in and of itself sounds kind of weird, but, external auditors get sued, especially by shareholders. So there's a shareholder suit where basically the shareholders can vote to, sue the auditor. Sometimes they sue management, whatever, if they think that they're acting not in the best interest of the company. And I didn't know, since internal audit is part of the company, if they could do that or not. And now, granted, my source is using Google, but my Google search tells me that this would be, um, extremely rare. And the reason it gives is directly to this reasonably prudent language, because there's no bright lines on reasonably prudent. That's up to the individual person. That's up to the individual, audit management, the audit board, uh, or the audit committee on the board. And then ultimately, if there were, if it ever did somehow get to a lawsuit, it would be up to, the judge to determine if they were reasonably prudent, or the jury or whoever. So again, because there's no bright line with that term, it would be really hard to, you know, really, come at someone unless they just did something egregious. Um, Now, I think if your internal audit group was, part of like a fraud scheme or something like that, then maybe individuals could be included in a shareholder suit. But I mean, I think that's sort of a different circumstance than just being negligent. All right. So now this gets back into some of the stuff we've talked about, but let's run through it sort of quickly. Planning. Now, I actually don't know about. It says the internal audit plan should be completed at the beginning of or just prior to the organization's fiscal year. Um, oh, I thought it said fiscal year end whenever I was reading through there. I was like, that's way too late to do it at the fiscal year end. Yeah, you should do it early, like basically before the year starts at the prior fiscal year end. You should be getting ready for the next year, because there's some stuff that you're going to be looking at all year long. So I read that sentence wrong the first time. But yeah, you definitely want to start that early. And then, this just goes through the steps. You want to meet with senior management, maybe with the audit committee. You want to get everything, sort of your plan approved. You want to do, risk analysis. Um, Gets down into here, CAE aligns audit resources. Resources are people. It's just, that's the term. Whenever you're in a service field or a service industry, or in this case, a service position within a company, you are the resource. So, they're aligning audit resources for the upcoming year. Um, then let's see, providing a definitive list of audit entities based on the prioritized risk. So you've done your risk assessment, you figure out exactly where you want to go. Like, because again, there's with internal audit, there's often traveling to production facilities or to other locations. Even if you're not even if you're not a production company, if you're a bank or something, then you're going to other locations to make sure that the local branches are doing the things the way they should be. So that sort of anything you can think about that has more than one location, you're going to end up traveling at least a little bit. So you want to make sure that you've sort of lined out, here's all the places we need to go to. Planning process should include the establishment of goals, the schedules, staffing schedules, and financial budgets, and it should reflect the internal audit charter and be consistent. That all makes sense. Now, this financial budgets, this is something I didn't think about with resource. Yes, people are resources, but you do have budget limits, and not just from a money perspective, but whenever we talk about staffing from a time perspective, if you're a massive organization and you have, hundreds of different operational places around the world, then physically sending your internal audit group to every single one is just not reasonable. The cost would be astronomical, and you can't really do that. So, there is a budget, and basically the chief audit executive and typically their managers along with them. It's usually not just one person acting in a bubble, but they figure out like, okay, where are our riskiest locations? Where are our most important locations? Let's go to those places. And this is how much we think it's going to cost. Can we send one person? Do we need to send two? Do we need to send more than that? How long do we need to be there? Is it a week-long thing? Is it 2 weeks? And figure all that out up front, because no one has time in the middle of the year to step back and say, well, geez, I don't know if we're going to have enough money, if we're going to run out of money if we keep, flying to China every week or something, crazy. So you got to pay attention to that stuff. Let's see. Communicating everything up through to the audit committee. Typically, you're also going to submit your planning stuff to senior management, not from the perspective of like, oh, give us specific comments or whatever, but it's so that they're aware of what you intend to do. And then they may have times whenever they say this particular thing is not going to work, or you're not going to be able to get to this location. There may be something that they can provide insight on. And so then you maybe have to adjust things a little bit. It happens. Resource management, all of these things. So again, I say resource management is people. Let's look at all this different stuff that they talk about. So organizational structure and staffing strategy, that's people. Right sizing, that's people. That's having the right size of your internal audit department and the right size of the people on like your different engagement teams. Staffing plans and human resources, obviously people. Hiring practices, obviously people. Strategic sourcing. I'm not sure what they're talking about with that. I don't know if that's a person related thing or not, or if it's like sourcing where you're getting your new hires from, or if that is some other kind of like maybe tied to the funding or whatever for the travel. I'm not sure. Training and mentoring, again, related to people. Career planning and professional development related to people. Scheduling people, there's the financial budget, not people. It's tied to the people because that's who you're budgeting for, but it's not necessarily people. And then the use of professional practice groups. That's if you're a big enough firm that you can have a professional practice group that can be, reviewing new standards, or that can have people who are subject matter experts that can then be consulted by, other parts of the company or other internal auditors or whatever. You see that a lot with external groups because you'll have folks. I know we always sent people to New York when I was with KPMG. That's where our Department of Professional Practice was. And a lot of times we would have senior managers who were wanting to make partner would go do a rotation there. And whenever you were there, you weren't working on clients. You were basically studying new and emerging accounting issues that could affect audits. You were writing them up and basically becoming subject matter experts in those things. You were communicating with, our teams that would reach out about a specific, whatever would be directed to someone on in that Department of Professional Practice who is sort of overseeing whatever the area is. And in that perspective, from the external side, like those people actually do like go in and they can provide you models and they can provide you stuff. Um, I'm not necessarily sure how having a DPP in an internal audit company would work. Just seems like it'd be a lot of money spent that wouldn't give much more of um, a benefit than not having them. I mean, maybe it would. Just doesn't seem logical to me. Policies and procedures, uh, basically making sure that you've established them and then followed them. Um, let's see, I think it says, consistent with the size of the internal audit function here, this part. That's sort of what I was talking about with, say budget resources and stuff. If you only have enough of a budget to have 5 people on your internal audit staff and your company has 45 locations, then you're not going to be able to get to all 45 locations because there's too much work that has to be done locally. There's too much just other things going on. And again, whenever we talk about travel and stuff, depending on the company, you might not have easy access to it. There are parts in here in West Virginia that are hours from the closest, airport that you can get to without having like a small personal plane or something. Um, so to have to fly into Charleston or Clarksburg or whatever and then drive over to someplace on the Ohio River, even if you fly into Parkersburg, you can still be an hour and a half away from the closest hospital. Or not hospital, what am I saying? Uh, Away from like the closest airport, or the plant might be. I have no idea where hospital came from. Anyway, sorry about that. So, you get there, you're renting cars, you're driving. It's just not feasible. You'd spend too much time traveling. So, you've got to keep in mind what kind of size you have whenever you're coming up with this. All right, let's keep going. Try and get to the last few here. Coordination, again, just making sure that everything is operating the way it should be. Coordinating who's where and when. Do you have certain deadlines that need to be met internally? Are you doing work on control testing that's going to try and assist the external auditors? Like, are they going to try and rely on some of your work? If so, what is their deadline? When do they need you to be done so that they can then come in and rely on what you've done? Um, let's see. This gets into risk appetite down here. Um, and we're going to talk more about risk appetite, but basically, some companies are willing to take more risk financially and operationally than others. They have chief executives and executive management teams that are more risk takers, more willing to push boundaries. And then you have, the very conservative group that's always hanging near the back. And so you've got to take into consideration what kind of risk your company's willing to take when you're designing your internal audit stuff. I mean, yes, a company that takes more risk may be more likely to have issues and may be harder to sort of, define some of the controls or, make sure they're operating. But, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to kill yourself on the internal audit. You need to line up your priority with the company's. And so, if the company expects things to be a little bit looser, then you as an internal audit staff are probably going to expect things to be a little looser, just because that's how the company works. And if you try to be, super strict on everything, then all you're going to do is hit, roadblock after roadblock. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Let's see. We're going to skip a couple slides to it, so we're getting close. This is getting back whenever we're talking about coordinating assurance efforts. That's coordinating like how well we can assure that the internal controls are functioning properly. And they get back into their 3 lines model, which we've talked a little bit about. You've got now in this one, you've got your first and second line that's within management. So your first line are the ones that are actually doing, where the controls located. Your second line are going to be those that are sort of monitoring or overseeing. And then internal audit is your third line, independent and objective. And then the board of governors, the governing body, needs to be communicating with everyone to make sure that things are working the way they should, and if they're not, to get things corrected. Reporting to senior management and the board. So down here, it gives a list of things that actually need to be communicated officially to. So like if you're significant deviations from approved engagement work schedules and reasons for such. Okay. Now, I don't know. I mean, this example, I don't know if there's any companies there that would know it or not, but think about like the hurricane that just hit Jamaica. Say you have an operation and you have, whatever it is, maybe you have something in Jamaica and your internal audit team was supposed to be there last week. Well, do you think they made it? No, they didn't. They were not able to fly into Jamaica and do whatever it was they were because there was a hurricane bearing down on the island. So there are just things that can happen that might prevent you from getting to a location, or maybe you run out of money and you can't get to, or maybe you have enough money left to do, one location's audit instead of 2, so you have to pick which one of the 2 you think needs the audit work done this year more than the other. So that those could all cause deviations. Communicating the staffing, the budgets. Typically, the budget is communicated as part of the overall budget process that is then, approved by management before a lot of this stuff even happens. And then anything that, action taken or needed. So if something needs to be done, or if you've, sort of addressed something, need to communicate that. If you've observed something but not really done anything about it, just like, hey, this is happening, here's a suggestion for how to fix it, you should communicate that. And then if we, instances of the management or audit acceptance of the risk of not correcting a significant engagement observation. So basically, if you observe something and you go to management and the audit committee and say, hey, I think that this is, possibly a big deal. And they're like, oh, we disagree. And so they don't, they just don't do anything. Then, it's going to be sort of your obligation to at least document that. And again, it's sort of a CYA, covering yourself up. And then letting them know, hey, if you don't do this, this is what could happen. So, all right. Let's see. This is more reporting. Let's see what typically roles and responsibilities. Okay, so this is just reporting all kinds of different business unit monitoring, outside auditor, key financial activity, risk management, legal compliance. So, where all those controls are being monitored or reviewed, um, you want to provide documentation related to that stuff, to be given at least to the audit committee. All right, governance. We sort of know governance in general means the actions that the board of directors is taking. So they say here a process conducted by the board of directors to authorize, direct, and oversee management towards the achievement of the organization's goals. So right there, board of directors. Governance is the board of directors, guiding the company in the direction that they want. Now, do you have a CEO, chairman of the board situation who is trying to direct the company where he or she specifically wants to go? Or do you just have a board in general that is, performing their duties as need be, and, sort of pushing the organization the way they see fit? So internal audit is supposed to assess and make recommendations to improve governance processes. So organizations governance processes for. So you're not telling the board of directors or whoever, the audit committee or the other committees, like, you guys are terrible, you need to go do this, this, and this. It's the processes that those groups oversee. So like if you have problems within the information technology group through your IT audit, then that needs to go to probably the head of the IT department. If you have, just other instances that are like that, where, or not the IT, but like in the IT, it needs to go to the IT committee, which typically you have one of those on your boards. Like most boards have stuff like that. They'll have an HR committee, a compensation committee, all these different things. And so if you discover something that sort of falls within one of those areas, then you want to make sure you get it communicated up. Let's go next one. So risk management, we talked quite a bit about risk. How much risk is the company willing to take? And I like this where it says deal with uncertainties. So oftentimes that's what risk is. Risk is the uncertainty of whether or not something's going to happen. And so we have to find out how risk averse or let's see, that's the negative side, I guess, or open to risk. A company or specific people within a company are open to. You need to be able to sort of define that, and that can be, do they push for higher EPS and net income every year? Do they apply pressure for certain things? That can all fall under risk. Continuing on with it, avoiding potential danger and preventing harmful actions. So, trying to make sure that no one's really doing things that they shouldn't be that's harmful to the company. Additionally, identifying opportunities that can be exploited. So let's jump down here to this list. So these risk responses is where management comes up and says, or how are we know all these risks, how are we going to respond to them? So are we going to try and avoid it? Like, we know that this is a risk could happen, we're going to try and avoid it somehow. Are we going to try and, do something so that the impact of the risk isn't as big? Are we going to share the risk between like groups or something, like, hey, we think this is going to happen, sort of everyone's going to have, a piece in this? Accepting risk, just say, hey, we know it's there, there's not really anything we can do to mitigate it, and let's just hope it doesn't come to fruition. If it does, then we will solve it at that time. And then this last one, exploiting opportunities, I wasn't sure what that meant, risk pursuit. And so again, I went to trusty Google and I was looking up what that meant. And that goes back to the whole idea of risk appetite and how much risk is a company willing to take. exploiting opportunities can be things like, trying to, march towards, higher um, net income or earnings per share, or, some of these financial metrics that we look at. Um, that can be what the exploiting opportunities risk pursuit really is. How much is the company going forward with those types of activities? Let's see. The role in enterprise risk management, basically, providing input and feedback. It's pretty straightforward. Um, evaluating the effectiveness of the risk management processes. So, just basically kind of like all of our other reporting, making sure that the enterprise risk management, as the overall company risk is sort of consistent with what the company um, is set up. If you have a very conservative company that doesn't like risk, but you're looking at it and you say, hey, a lot of these controls aren't asking for, real uh, knowledge or whatever. That's not the right word. Trying to think of, I hate that whenever I forget words. But basically, forget that. Basically, do you, once again, are we aligning our risk with what the company expects? If the company expects higher revenues and so they are pushing certain things, then you want to make sure you've aligned your risk to say, okay, this is sort of how the company is operating right now. Like we need to sort of mimic that a little bit. Here's a pretty chart of what you can, could, and shouldn't do. It's illegible unless I blow it up. Controls, we've talked a lot about controls at this point in time. Basically you're evaluating them. Quality assurance, this falls within the standards, but it's basically just making sure that things don't get stagnant. That your chief audit executive is, continually looking to improve the program or the function and continue to sort of make things better. Make you more efficient and more prudent and productive for the company. Um, and that's sort of a general expectation that I think most people would be expected to do. If you just do the same thing constantly, then eventually that's going to come back to bite you because things change. This again is illegible. There are some performance measures that you can take of the group, and especially the chief audit executive, whenever they're trying to figure out, again, all those staffing and resources and all those things. These are different things that they can look at to try and figure out, how to appropriately staff and size and disperse the individuals that are part of the group. And then last thing here, how do you use technology? We're seeing more and more of it, and we're going to continue to see more and more technology, doing more work and helping make things more efficient. Personally, I think that firms have to be careful with it, especially as we start to move firms into sort of these AI type models. Just because there's certainly risk there, and there's also risk that we've seen it time and time again of some of these guys giving back completely wrong information that ChatGPT lying on references and stuff, and we've got some of the other ones doing similar things. And so as companies start to integrate that into their technological stuff, then they need to keep that in mind, that it may not do the exact thing you need it to do. And then I think, this is just these are ways that they can add value. You're welcome to pause and read that if you like, but we've talked about how internal audit adds value. All right, so that's it. It took a little longer to walk through than I thought. I tried to speak quickly. I hope that you guys have a good weekend, and we'll be back in on, let's see. So yeah, next week we're just going to hit another couple chapters. And then the week after that, we're going to have a guest speaker and then uh, another quiz leading up to, we're covering a lot of material over the next few weeks. But again, we're sort of skipping through them fairly quickly. You should see the quiz grades up. The quiz grades were pretty good this time. I did throw out one question. We'll talk about that in class next week. Otherwise, have a great weekend. Stay safe, and I will see you guys next week.